But my father's principle was that you're only allowed to speak English at home. And if we didn't speak English at home, we would be spanked.
Dr. Pastor Uri Brito, thank you so much for being here, my friend.
Great to be here, Matthew. It's good to see you again, brother.
Yeah, you too. It's always a joy to hang out. So selfishly, I'm just happy for a couple hours with you.
Yeah, well, likewise.
Sit back and chat.
Yeah.
When I think of you, I think of you're always so jovial and you just exude joy, which is a fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And you represent that well. So.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'm grateful. The joy of the Lord is our strength, and I try to live that as genuinely as I can and try to communicate that through my actions as well. And I think people are sometimes reflections of who they are shepherded by. And so if my congregation is going to be a joyful congregation, they need to make sure there's an example leading the way in that regard.
Yeah, well, and you are a great example.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you saying that.
But I also know how extremely busy you are, so I'm very honored that you would give me some of your time, man.
Yeah, you're very welcome. You're very welcome.
That's my little introduction, but how do you introduce yourself these days?
I think when you're in the community for a very long time, as I have, there's a growing familiarity that just is in the nature of a community. It's a very intimate community. Our community is very intimate, with the school and the church and the fact that it's Pensacola, Florida. So we see each other at Sam's Club, at gas stations, and there's a beauty to that. But there's an intimacy that also sort of allows you to think of people in their own habitat as opposed to thinking of them and how they're perceived on social media. So when I'm introduced in academic environments or pastoral conferences, Reverend Dr. Uri Brito. But around here, I learned this from the great Mickey Schneider, who is Greg Bonson's pastor. He said, my nickname is Pastor. And so I just, here in town, I go by Pastor. And I think that's a way to honor, but not to offer the kind of elite or the elitism that comes sometimes with this kind of verbiage. And Pastor is just casual. It's a shepherding title. It's a biblical title. And that's how people refer to me here in town, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
You mentioned our community. I was going to ask this later, but this is probably a good time to talk about it. I feel like... And as an example, I just got my hair cut by Josh Leone.
Yeah.
East Hill Barbershop, best haircut in town, but also a great conversation.
Yeah.
And we always enjoy each other's company. We always talk about Providence and Trinitas and the cross.
Yeah.
And I feel like we have an uncommon unity here in Pensacola. And maybe it's other places, but I haven't seen it. Just the crossover of fellowship and community amongst different churches in our Christian school, and maybe the school is part of what brings all that together, but it feels uncommon, and I love it. I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
I think the communities are formed by their institutions, and so whatever institutions take a place of prominence in any community, they will form that community for good or for ill, and that's just the nature of it. Our communities have gone through various stages of growth. We've had seasons of great prosperity, seasons of difficulty, seasons of division. And what they do in the long term is they cause this kind of spiritual scarring. And the scars are there, but the scars don't necessarily cause the detriment of the institution or community. They can cause the maturation of a community, right? And what's happened, I think, in our community is that those scars have remained. If you want to look at it, they're there for you to see. There's historical evidence of it, perhaps even photographs of it. Nevertheless, they just become a part of who you are, but they're not the sum of who you are. And so those scars, they allow you to look at your history and now interpret it redemptively. And I think that's what our communities have done, especially through the labors of our churches, in particular, Providence and the church where you are a member of, the Cross. I think our communities have been able to be replenished and renewed by godly people through various seasons. And as a result, that has added the kind of gravitas that I think our educational institutions need. Every institution is shaped by the institution of the church, which is the central institution in God's kingdom. And so I think that level of intimacy creates a kind of paradigm that allows other side or parallel institutions to also function as they should. If you have unstable ecclesiastical institutions, you'll always have unstable academic institutions. And so if you think even of the great academic institutions of civilization, the Harvards, the Yales, and all that, they're surrounded by liberalism. And as a result, they'll become liberalized as well. And so I think the intimacy we have here is certainly unique. I can say that as someone who has traveled the United States and the world, we have something very unique here. And I think we're over that stage where we're concerned about how particular churches are operating. And now we're at a stage in our existence where we are concerned about how our churches are living faithfully before God. And we can look at our sister congregation and say, thanks be to God. And so that allows a level of collaboration that I think prospers the whole community at large.
Yeah, amen. Are there things you think other communities can do to help foster that?
I think pastors need to realize that their particular function, their calling, is to their local congregations. They are shepherds and pastors of their local body. That is who God has called them to shepherd. And when opportunity arises, these pastors ought to sort of stretch their hands farther as a way of inviting other people into their world, to their culture. And other pastors do the same with us. That is what we call Catholicity. It's the ability to sort of reach out beyond that primary calling that you have, but also see that the church is far greater than your own. And I think communities need to see that no longer from the sense of numerical concerns that such and such a church is bigger than theirs or such and such a pastor has a greater platform. But what are the specific things that God has called you to do in your context? And once you have a confidence that that's what you're called to do, now you can begin to reach out and say, how can I bless the community I am in? But you can't bless the community unless you have a particularized stability in the place God has called you to. A lot of pastors begin in the opposite, where they want to find ways to bless the public sphere while forsaking their local callings. And that is a misprioritization. That is a disordered loves. And I think there's a great concern there. So I would encourage pastors or institutional leaders to focus on their little tribes. And once there's a stability, sometimes that takes a little bit longer than others, but once that stability is present, then he can begin to reach out and begin to extend the benedictions that he has experienced to other places as well.
That's good. Very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Uri. Well, the primary purpose of this podcast is just to let my guests tell their story. And often I try to introduce that through the lens of our relationship.
Yeah.
So how do we know each other, Uri?
How do you and I know each other? That's a great question. I feel like I've known you for a very long time. You've been part of my life for a long time, Matthew. I suspect we probably met each other at a Trinitas gathering, perhaps in one of those beginning of the year gatherings outside in the back of Trinitas. And the few memories that I have of us getting to know each other early on, I think came very seamless in many ways. You've known me for a long time. I talk for a living. It's what I do. And when you live by rhetoric, you die by rhetoric as well. And I meet people from various places, and pastors are at least, they supposedly have this gift of allowing conversations to flow a little easier. They have mastered the ability to ask questions, to talk to the young and old. And the one thing I remember about talking about you is that I did not have to put any effort into that conversation. And it was very seamless, and it was very easy to have conversations with you. And I remember we found some common ground very quickly. And I think specifically, either there or in a father-son campout, we had a chance to discuss Reformed theology, some of the things that kind of make us tick and has been formational in who we are. And I remember distinctly having a few conversations with you at the father-son campout about the role of the church and some of the transitions that you had gone through, even in your ecclesiastical maturation, some of your backgrounds. That's how we, I think, had our initial conversations, and that has developed to where it's very hard to see you and not talk to you. And I always try to make a way to find Matthew Fuller so I can just offer my greetings. I just have such a high respect for you and your role in the community. I'm very grateful for you, brother. I mean that with all sincerity.
Thank you, Uri. That means a lot, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, I often, if we're in a room together, I often hear your booming voice, Matthew.
Yes.
And I love it. It fills my heart with joy.
Yeah.
Appreciate our friendship very much.
Likewise.
Yeah. And I think, I know we met early on, but I know that camp out, we really connected.
Yeah.
And that's a story with a lot of folks at Trinitas. That camp out is so fruitful.
Yeah, it really is.
Ed and I talked about that too when he was on.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. That's where we really connected for the first time too.
A lot of bonds and good conversations happen there.
Yeah.
Sometimes middle of the night, sometimes early in the morning.
You get a bunch of men out in the woods with a campfire and no cell signal. Good things are going to happen.
Yep. No one's degrees matters there. Yeah. Everybody is just man.
That's right.
And I love that.
We're all struggling to put our tents up.
Yes. Well, you don't have to share all these private details out here, but
lots of good memories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Uri, where did you grow up? And can you tell us about your childhood and what that was like and the kind of home you were in?
Yeah. I am 100% Brazilian. 100%. I was born in a city called Natal in the northeastern part of Brazil. I didn't grow up in Natal. My father was a Baptist minister. I grew up in a city called Mossoró, which is known for their extensive oil production. So a lot of oil rigs in the area, a very significant part of the financial dimension of that particular town. And I grew up in that environment, grew up in a poor neighborhood. And my father had a manse that he lived in, owned by the church that he pastored. It's called Maranatha Baptist Church. And so I remember that very clearly. So I grew up in the northeastern part of Brazil, a part of Brazil that's known much more for their poverty than anything else. Very culturally rich with great foods, great dances, great music, great soccer. But it's not what people think of when they think of Brazil. People know Brazil has a poverty element of it, but I suspect when people think of Brazil, they think of Rio and São Paulo and these more prestigious places. But I grew up in the opposite end, in the northeast, in the coastal town. And I grew up in Mossoró, but then we moved later on to Natal. After my father died, we moved back to my hometown. And Natal is the capital of the state I grew up in, with around, I think at this point, about 1.3 million people. But a coastal tourist town, very much like Pensacola, gorgeous beaches, sand dunes, and we attract a lot of Europeans because of our beaches. So summertime, which is essentially all year long, was replete with a host of Europeans who would descend upon the little South American northeastern town of Natal.
How old were you when your dad passed away?
My father died when I was 16 years of age. He died in 1996. He was a minister and a university professor as well. And so he was kind of a blend of academic and pastoral vitality. I had the opportunity to watch him do a lot of that work. I even attended a couple of his university classes where he took me a few times. And of course, I got to witness the pastoral work firsthand. But in 1996, he had a heart attack and died very rapidly. And he was at the ripe age of 41 years of age. And so it was very, very unexpected. And of course, it shocked the community. He's a very well-known figure in the community, involved in the political side of the community, but also the church side of the community as well. And so it was a very unique moment. I didn't know what my father's reality was in the community, but you find these things out in funerals, and he was very, very honored and respected. And so at that point, at 16, my life took a very radical turn.
Yeah. How do you feel like that shaped you?
Well, I went from someone who treasured everything a Brazilian boy treasures, which is music and soccer, which is they're both full-time jobs. And I did that. That was my life. School was just a side gig. And when my father died, I'm a firstborn. And so when my father died, that transition took place very rapidly. I went from a child a young 16-year-old who was very interested in the world of music and soccer, to now realizing that I have to take a particular position now in my family not just merely because it was given to me, but now I have to exercise that role as a firstborn. And so my mother was a widow, a very young widow. And at that point, I began to take a position of leadership. And at that point, I distinctly remember several things happening in my life that pushed me from the kind of immaturity that I was pursuing to assume certain roles that I was not expected to, but God, I think, providentially prepared me for. Even though I think my life as a Christian at the time was someone who was just very much content with milk, content with things that were leading to a very immature Christian existence. Even though that was there was a level of maturity that occurred from that moment on, and I just never looked back.
Tough circumstances, but the Lord uses them to take us to where He wants us to be.
Yes, and he certainly did. And one of the things that happened very early on, Matthew, was that He put me in a role where I became a teacher. So the two things that I never wanted to do in my life, because I watched my father do it, I never wanted to be a teacher, and certainly did not want to be a pastor. My father had a unique role in the community, and I remember very distinctly many evenings, he didn't have his own office. Our house was his office, when congregants would come to his house, and I would hear a lot of yelling, and I remember the congregants leaving very frustrated, and my father leaving very frustrated as well. And I said, I don't want any of that. And of course, in God's providence, here I am. I both teach and preach. And at that point, at the age of 16, I began to look for a profession at that point. And lo and behold, there was an English teaching job that I was able to secure, and I began to teach English at that time, and I taught English for 2 years. It was an interesting time because the internet wasn't making any waves at the time, and Brazilians love music, and so in my classroom, there were lawyers and doctors, very prestigious members of the community and the society, and there I was teaching these individuals, and one of the things they really wanted to do is they wanted to know what the American lyrics were saying. So whenever pop song came out, they wanted me to translate it, they wanted me to sing it, and so I was able to pull out my guitar. So it was a very, very nice gig where I was able to put the things that I loved into practice, but now in English. Incidentally, that the renewal of English in my own life, I had lived in the U.S. for a short period earlier, but my father's principle was that you're only allowed to speak English at home, and if we didn't speak English at home, we would be spanked. We would be disciplined, and I was disciplined many times. When you go out, you can speak Portuguese with your friends. And so that allowed us to keep English and keep the centrality of English, which would prepare me for the life ahead. And so I taught English for a couple of years. And then after that, after 2 years, my mother came to me and said, what would you consider going back to the United States and maybe going through high school, your senior year of high school, and then coming back using that experience to teach and get a better job here in Brazil? And so I said, that sounds reasonable. And so I went back to the U.S. in 1998, and I've been here ever since.
And we're glad you're here.
Yeah.
How did you get to the U.S. the first time?
The first time, my father received a scholarship to attend Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina. So I have very strong fundamentalist bona fides. And so that was the kind of the world I grew up in. In the extraordinary world of Bob Jones University, in those days, in the late 80s, Bob Jones was sort of viewed as the capstone, as sort of the paragon of what true university looks like. And at that time, it was the place where any Republican candidate needed the approval of in order to run for president. And so in the late 80s, you got the George W. Bushes. So every Republican needed to go there to get the approval of Bob Jones University. It was also, incidentally, there is a particular stereotype of fundamentalism as this this kind of backwoods, snake handling, King James only sort of world. But Bob Jones University was very unique. It was the first place where I saw one of the world's leading art galleries, which my father worked at, and the first place where I experienced the first Shakespeare play. And so the combination of Shakespeare and art was introduced to me in my early days, 7, 8 years old. And so Bob Jones was a different kind of fundamentalist institution. It was a very prestigious, very sophisticated, even though they had very strong moral principles that guided them, some healthier than others, but nevertheless, I was really grateful. So we lived in that part of the country in South Carolina for a few years. And then later on, when I came back to the U.S. in 1998, I lived in a little town called Altoona, Pennsylvania. And as you can imagine, a little boy who grew up in tropical Brazil now is experiencing the very, very cold winters of Altoona, Pennsylvania.
That had to be quite the shock.
It was quite a shock. And when the boomers talk about walking 3 miles in the snow barefooted, it wasn't exactly my story, but I did walk many, many miles, not barefooted with boots, but in the snow. And I experienced many falls, but I always got up and made it to the bus stop on time. But for a Latin boy to experience that snow was quite shocking.
Yeah. That's cool. Where did your dad pick up English to begin with? Was he fluent before he came to Bob Jones, or what sort of drove that desire in him?
Yeah, my father took some English prior to coming to the U.S. When he received the scholarship, it was just a great opportunity for him to come to the United States and to finish his master's degree. And he improved his English significantly, obviously. He read very well. His English was very broken, but he read really well, and he delivered things very well as well. He's a great rhetorician. And his English was broken, which I think it made it even more sort of dramatic in the way it was sort of manifested. I always enjoyed hearing him speak in English. And so but for us, there are three of us, three children, three of us. For us, since we learned it very, very young, English was a much more natural development. And I think we kept we kept the intonations, we kept the accentuation, we kept all these things. Whereas my parents, because they learned it much later in life, they struggled a bit with it. And so when we went back to Brazil after living in South Carolina for 4 years, it was imperative that we spoke English at home. My father always knew, even long before English has always been in some ways this universal language, but long before it became a technological language or the language of business, the language of the masses, my father already knew that it was significant that we kept up a second language, particularly English. And I really give thanks to God, even though I was disciplined many times for not wanting to continue that habit and that practice and that discipline. But he was very steady in his demands and requirements. And with many toils and snares and spankings, we persevered.
Yeah. Well, he was very wise to do that. And what a gift in the end.
Yeah. I'm grateful. Yeah. Very grateful.
That's great. Do you remember much of your childhood in the poor oil-producing city that you lived in? What I
remember is coming back from the United States and moving to the same home where we lived prior in Mossoró. And I remember driving into where we would live and seeing around 300 favelas, which are shacks. And I remember the smells very vividly. I remember the stench. I remember experiencing poverty in a way that I'd never experienced before. And you have to realize sort of the visual, even the visceral reaction coming from the United States, where there's all this abundance, and then coming to our neighborhood and seeing that 300 favelas had been established there, which weren't there prior, but now they're established. And then the other thing I remember is doing evangelism in those favelas with my father. I confess I never liked it. I was somewhat afraid of it. But the more we did it, the more comfortable I became with the people. They realized they were just people living in extreme poverty, trying to make ends meet and begging for food in the streets. But they were also my soccer buddies as well. And we loved playing soccer in the rain. When it poured rain in Brazil, it was like one of those Hebraic Middle Eastern rain, showers of blessings, We'd go out and we would play for hours and hours and hours. And at that moment, even though we were kind of a middle-class Brazilian family, playing with the kids in the favela, it made no difference. We were all equal, and we all loved the same thing. And those are very clear memories, the smells and the soccer balls, which were always flat, but it never made a difference for us when we played. Yeah.
Is there any memory that was negative from that experience that you look back on? And
the negative memories, I think, was when I grew up in that environment. I grew up in an extremely, of course, Brazil is the largest Catholic country in the world. My entire neighborhood was Catholic. I was the only the only evangelical Protestant Baptist kid in the whole neighborhood. And perhaps the thing that I remember the most in that regard, in my relationship with these individuals, these other kids, was how much apathy was part of their religious expression, their religious DNA. The Roman Catholic, and still certainly to this day, but especially in South American countries, is just a cultural leftover from their fathers. And even Mass itself is very poorly attended, very poorly attended. And I remember having the richness of my own heritage and growing up in a congregation that loved the scriptures, that sang the good old hymns. And I remember hearing about the religious experience of my fellow soccer players and realizing that there wasn't any. There was nothing distinct about their religious expression that they could share and say, wasn't this fantastic? Their experience of watching and playing soccer was far more a religious manifestation of who they were than their experience at the local Catholic parish, you know? And that was sad to me, especially as I look back, because that led to, especially as I watched them grow, or as I saw their pictures later on in life, I realized that virtually none of them got married. Virtually none of them were living anything that resembles a Christian life. And so the level of apathy and complacency, coupled by what I experienced as sort of a form of Catholic mysticism, just produced a generation of apostates. And so it gives me even greater love for my childhood, even though I've moved away from my Baptist heritage, but greater love for what my father established, what the local congregation established. And it really rooted me in very strong biblical rhythms and habits that I carry to this day.
Yeah. Again, another blessing.
Yeah, truly. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you ever experience persecution because you were the only Protestant evangelical there?
No, not really. No persecution. I think apathy produces a lack of persecution. If they had a minutia of interest, they would see the differences. But again, Brazil, just like Catholicism, just like the level of universal Roman Catholicism we see in our day, it doesn't produce generational faithfulness. It produced generational triviality when it comes to your religious expression. So as a result, we very clearly had a greater influence. The solo Protestant had a far greater influence in the multitude of Catholics. My father had this very, very small vehicle, and one of the memories I have is of my father packing maybe 7 or 8 kids in the trunk and taking them to church on Sunday morning. And their parents didn't care if they went to Mass. They just cared that they were out of the home. And so my dad was very evangelistic in nature and took them to church, and it was a good childhood in the sense that we spent all week together, and then we'd have this sort of plethora of kids who would follow us to church on Sunday morning. And that was a very good memory that I have a good recollection of.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So let's go back to, you came back to the United States the second time to
Correct.
Finish your senior year in high school.
Yes.
Take us through that journey. You didn't go back to Brazil after that?
I did not. Okay. In fact, I had graduated from high school in Brazil. So when I came to the U.S., I graduated a second time, which I thought was a relatively, when I did my graduation speech, I made that observation that this was my second time graduating, and over 700 people laughed hysterically at that. And I thought, what did I say? But I guess graduating twice from high school is not a very abnormal procedure, let's put it that way. But I graduated a second time, and it was there in Altoona, Pennsylvania, sort of mountainous regions there in Pennsylvania, where I was able to meet some older and more godly saints, mature godly saints, who really took an interest in my interest in scriptures and teaching and preaching, and cultivated and nourished that. And at that moment, and somewhere in the middle of my senior year, I had a revival, a renewal, and a passion for the church that I had lost for several years. And that renovation of desire and passion for the church sort of stirred me to pursue the ministry. I didn't know exactly where that would lead me. I've always had academic interest, but yet I fell in love with the church. I fell in love with the church. And in that sense, I, in some ways, came back to my first love, which I think had fallen a wayside in terms of interest, but I fell in love once again with the church. And that was a very interesting season because when I experienced that, now I began to deal with my fellow classmates differently. I began to think through life differently. I began to have a more objective and concrete sense of what God was doing in my life at that moment. I didn't feel like I was wandering through sort of academic classes anymore. There was an objectivity to it. There was a trajectory that was set in place. I didn't know where it was going to lead, but I knew it was leading to the church. And so that was that happened somewhere around 1998. And that was a very, very moving part of my life.
Yeah. What steps did you take to sort of pursue ministry after that?
Yeah, great question. I attended because this elderly lady I lived with attended a Brethren church. This is the foot washing congregation. Foot washing congregation. I had no idea what a Brethren community was, but in Pennsylvania it's pretty significant, the Brethren community. So I attended that congregation, and the pastor, who was an elderly man, also took an incredible time with me, took me out to eat, and really mentored me through that season. And I was able to sort of sit under his labors and his teaching, and I was tutored by him. And so that, in many ways, was even though my desires were present, it was right there, I think, in that Brethren congregation, through their annual practice of foot washing, that I developed a sort of an appetite for the labors of pastoral ministry. And I watched this man as he ministered to a largely elderly congregation. I think I might have been the youngest member of that congregation. The congregation was very much elderly. And as he ministered to them, I watched him. And I watched the way he interacted. I watched the way he greeted. I watched the way he interacted with the people in the nursing home. I watched what he did after the service. He was somebody who was very much attuned to the needs of his own congregation. And I just watched. And then little by little, he began to give me opportunities to share my testimony, to sing a special, to speak during youth activities, to speak during campouts. And he just allowed this, he allowed me to exercise my gifts in places where they were not threatening, where I didn't feel like my gifts would be negated, but just exercised, and I would develop that art. And those were very monumental stages of my life, because there I felt a kind of ease in speaking to people in public places, in ministering to them. And so I'm very grateful for First Church of the Brethren in Altoona, Pennsylvania, which I suspect is still there. The pastor has died since, but that was there's a moment there in that congregation on a Sunday morning that I remember distinctly saying, I think that's what I want to do. Yeah.
It's neat to see in God's providence, him writing our story and placing us in different scenes along the way, preparing us for what's next.
Well, and I think we always talk about hard providences, Matthew, but I think it's very hard to understand. And as a pastor now, I can see these things when I tell congregations. So the reason we talk so much about suffering, it's not because everybody's going to suffer tomorrow, but it's because we're preparing them for the eventuality of suffering, so that when suffering does come, they have this repertoire of language and categories to use through suffering. And I remember that when my father died, of course, everyone's like, why would, the questions arose, which are natural questions. Why would God take a servant at the age of 41? Why would God take such a young man? And looking back, I realized that if my father had not died, I would never have gone this trajectory. I would never have received the calling that God has given me. So God is using everything for his own glory, but also for our good as well.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. So you have this moment of realizing this is what I want to do. This is my calling. Where do you go from there?
Well, that's a terrific story. My father went to Bob Jones University, as I mentioned earlier. At that point, at the end of my senior year, I had around $37 in my bank account. I had attempted to apply for Bob Jones University. I did apply, but I was rejected. And so my hopes was to go back to my father's alma mater. That didn't happen. So now I'm left with about 6 weeks before school ends. My student visa is about to expire, which means that I have to go back to Brazil. I'm about to purchase a ticket to go back to Brazil. And somewhere in the last 6 weeks of school, an ensemble from Clearwater, Florida, Central Florida, show up to sing from Clearwater Christian College, initially a Bible Presbyterian college, a fundamentalist Bible Presbyterian college. It's the fundamentalist version of Presbyterianism. They show up, and the president, Dr. George Eustra, who just died, I think, 6 months ago, incidentally, very tall man, probably 6'5", had worked for the Reagan administration, a real fascinating man, was introducing the college, and I was there as one of the students, seniors. And as soon as the ensemble sang beautifully, I went to introduce myself, and I said, I think I remember something to the extent of, Dr. Eustra, my name is Uri Brito. I have a great interest in apologetics and pastoral ministry. And I think I was fairly bold. I said, and I would love a scholarship from your school. Yeah.
Nice.
And he said, well, young man, thank you for introducing yourself. And I appreciate you talking to me. That was the extent of what he said. And I said, well, that didn't go as well as I planned. And so that happened. And after that, I went home and I really began preparing. I actually began distinctly remembering, I remember packing up my suitcase to go back to Brazil, making certain phone calls and prepare what it would look for me to go back, maybe pick up the same job I had prior. And about 2 weeks before the end of the school year, I received a phone call from Ken Puckett. That's his name, Ken Puckett, who still corresponds with me via Facebook, decades later. And he contacted me and he said, and I remember almost verbatim what he said. He said, Uri, this is Ken Puckett. I'm the head of the financial department here at Clearwater Christian College. And he said, this may seem overwhelming to you, but we decided to give you a scholarship of $8,000, which would cover, at that time, college wasn't as expensive. $8,000 covered my entire bill for the first year. And so I wept. I wept in Hebraic fashion. I wept bitterly, just very loudly. And he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm okay." When I composed myself, I said, "Thank you so much." And he said, we will contact you. We'll send you, be prepared for some things will show up in your mail. And I said, "Thank you." So I left that conversation, and I remember praising God for the rest of the day. I went upstairs, listened to my favorite radio show in the evening, which was Renewing Your Mind with Dr. R.C. Sproul. This is in 1999. And that's another story too. But at that point, God had changed my plans completely, and I just was gracious. Called my mother and said, I got a scholarship, and she wept. And then I still had another 3 months before school started in Clearwater. And so I said, what am I going to do here for 3 months? Without me inquiring at all, a week later, the head of the maintenance department called me at Clearwater and said, listen, I don't know what you're doing for the summer, but we would love to have you work for our maintenance crew here, our grounds crew here at Clearwater Christian College. So you can come earlier. And so everything came together. And I remember that about a week later, I was packed up and I got on a Greyhound bus from Altoona, Pennsylvania. And that was a 21-hour drive with 5 or 6 stops in between. And the one thing I remember distinctly was that I sat next to a man that was completely drunk for the entirety of the 21 hours.
Oh, wow.
And he laid his head on my shoulders for at least half of those 21 hours. And so as you can imagine, by the time I arrived in Clearwater bus station, when I arrived, I was just completely physically exhausted, just exhausted. I don't think I slept a minute of that whole ride. And when I arrived, there was no one at the bus station waiting for me. And I said, what have I done? What have I done? And about 45 minutes later, somebody showed up with a sign that said, Mr. Uri Brito. And so he took me to the college, and that was the first time I ever stepped foot in the college, the first time I ever stepped foot in a different state, certainly the first time in Florida. Everything was so new, and I think I arrived around about 12:30 in the morning. And so there was nobody on campus. It was summertime, and so I was very much in a desert place. And so But when I walked in and when I slept that first night in my dorm, I remember thinking, this is an entire new chapter that God is writing. And so that was the beginning of a whole new life.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, you can't ride a Greyhound bus without having a good story come
You
out.
need a story in a Greyhound bus, yeah? You sure do.
But what a journey.
Yeah, it was quite a journey. It was quite a journey.
So classes begin the following semester in the fall, and
Here's what happened. I, very early on, had a roommate who eventually became a Lutheran pastor. An interesting story, was my best man, who unfortunately later apostatized. So it's a sad story. But those early days in 1999, we spent much of the summer talking and chatting and theologizing late into the night and eating ramen noodles, which were the manna of college.
yeah, the staple of college.
The staple of college, yeah. And late into the night, we talked theology, pastoral ministry, and those were very fruitful conversations. But what happened was that when school began, when the college year began, there was one class called Introduction to Psychology. And it was Christian, just the nature of it. Today we would call this something like Introduction to Biblical Counseling. It was very much in the J. Adams world. And what they did is they gave you 30 seconds to introduce yourself. So a class of 200 students, 30 seconds, freshman class, to introduce yourself. I went up and shared my favorite Bible verse, which is what Baptists do, right? You got to have a Bible verse, which was Philippians 1:21, for to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Talked about who I was. And I remember when I stepped down that everybody started applauding. And I did not know what was happening because nobody applauded for anyone else. And I thought, what in the world is happening here? That was my introduction to what would eventually become when I became student body chaplain, freshman chaplain, sophomore chaplain, junior chaplain, and senior chaplain. So I was the chaplain of the school and of my class for virtually every year I was on campus. And it all started with a 30-second introduction of myself. I said, God works in mysterious ways. I was so grateful. And I think what they probably noticed was a certain gravitas and sobriety and maybe lucidity about what I was saying, that I wasn't treating anything about what I was saying with flippancy.
Yeah.
And I think they just picked that up very quickly. And they said, that sounds like a good guy to represent us here. And so that was the beginning of things. But the other element too, is that I became so enthusiastic about theological studies and theological language and interest that all I did, this is probably the first time I'm sharing this outside of my own family, my wife who knows this, all I did was read theology, which meant that everything else became secondary, if not tertiary. So this is what happened. At the end of my first semester, I had an average of 1.8. That was my GPA average. The problem was that in order to continue and preserve your student visa, you needed at least a 2.0 average GPA. And so I had one more semester to get that up. But I had emphasized so much of that first semester that I was putting aside math. Nothing else carried any importance to me. And so that second semester, you better believe it, things changed pretty dramatically. I got a tutor who eventually became my wife, a math tutor, and everything else kind of fell into place. And I think I went from a 1.8 to a 2.7. And then after that, I ended up doing very, very well. The 4 years, I became the academy took a whole new interest. I realized that life had to be a bit more eclectic than simply reading Bible books and preparing for sermons. And so that was a wonderful transition, but it was a frightening moment for me where I had to realize that I love this so much, but I have to realize the world is far bigger than just my peculiar interest, and God was working even through that. So it was a frightening moment, but it was the right moment to be frightened.
Yeah. Well, like much of your story, none of it is uninteresting. So.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you when and where you met Melinda. So
Melinda is just a fascinating figure. Really behind, if you're going to have the kind of responsibilities that I have in my day, you need someone who functions in a queenly fashion. Otherwise, your whole life disintegrates and you can't accomplish what you accomplish. And I met her. I knew her brother, who worked as a security guard on campus as well. And he was a bodybuilder, and he was a very frightening man. and he was he had a lot of friends. He was also, I think he was pursuing something youth ministry. I think it was the title of the degree that they offer there at Clearwater. And now he's a very successful pastor in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I think he actually pastors the largest church in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And so just a wonderful guy. I have a great love for TJ. And so I knew TJ, and I also knew Melinda's oldest sister, whom I spent a lot of time with, and just delightful, full of joy, very much like Melinda. And I knew her younger sister as well. I met her younger sister later. And Melinda came into the picture through some of the classes we took together. And we had lots of classes together. We had Introduction to Religion, Introduction to the New Testament, Old Testament. We took a lot of these classes together. But it was in math class. I was taking a class. I suspect she would tell the story very similarly, though I have exaggerated it in the past. I'm going to try to give you an accurate picture of it. I was taking a math class. It was a Mathematics 099, which was very befitting for my level of math at the time. For her, it was a quick, easy A+. She's still, to this day, very mathematically numbers-oriented. But I sat in the front row, like a good preacher boy, right? A good Baptist boy, sat in the front row, and our professor was a Chinese man whose English was virtually untranslatable. Nobody understood what he was saying. But I loved distracting him with theological questions because he was amused by our amusement. And so he tried to engage us. And so the class went by without much math and a lot of distraction. Well, Melinda was part of the crew in the back who was just always entertained by what was happening up front. And so, nevertheless, class continued. And for a season, I realized that my grades needed to be, my grades needed really to go up. And they were not going in that trajectory. And so I think his name was Dr. Chi-Cheng Lo. And so even the name is iconic. Dr. Chi-Cheng Lo, I think one time made the very bold statement up front. He said something like, "Who would like to tutor this young man here?" And I don't recall specifically, she might know, if Melinda volunteered or if I volunteered her. Again, I knew her siblings. That was the beginning of our tutoring classes, which never truly merged into mathematics. If it did, it was a very minor part of it. It merged into a lot of interest, and my interests at the time, which were theological interests. It became an opportunity to indoctrinate who would become my future wife. You know? And I think she was enamored because Melinda has always had a greater fascination with the theological discourse than girly talk that happened on the side. All the girls were talking about the latest makeup, the latest shampoo. She was much more concerned about other things as well. She always has had a very sober mind and lucid mind of these things. And so we met there. We got to know each other through some of the tutoring sessions. And eventually we began courting. And then I had to borrow a friend's cell phone. And I had to borrow a friend's cell phone to call her father. And after a long time, I called her father. And I remember it was around 8 o'clock at night. I was walking near the maintenance shed. And I didn't have a cell phone, but this friend of mine did. And I called her and asked for his permission to marry his daughter. And he very gladly said, "Yes, you may marry my daughter." And so I proposed at the beach, very typical of coastal Florida. And we were married. This is another great story. We were married a week after we graduated. So we both graduated on May 10th. And May 17th of 2003, we got married. If I can tell one more story in that regard,
yes,
this
please
is
do. Yeah,
sort of one of those happy footnotes. My mother could not come to the U.S. because she was a widow, and the U.S. government would not allow her to come. And so at that point, I began to do what now I do kind of for a living. I began to do some politicking. And I began to use resources I had on campus, Dr. Eustra, whomever who had political connections. Melinda at the time went to a Jeb Bush event. He was one of our former Florida governors, for those non-Floridians listening. And she was able to speak with the governor. My father-in-law, who worked for the police department in Tallahassee, was able to speak with the governor, was able to call the embassy. I don't know exactly what triggered what, but what I do know is that 4 weeks before our wedding, my mother received what was typical a tourist visa of 6 months instead of that, the government gave her a 10-year visa.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So God was just gracious. And so she showed up a couple of days before the wedding and was able to be a part of the wedding. The only family member that was able to be a part of the wedding. And so my sister came as well, but my mother was the representative of the Britos that came and was able to be a part of that wedding celebration. So it was real delightful, but another evidence of God's providence through the political realm.
Yeah. He's so gracious.
Yes, he is. Absolutely.
Yeah. So did your mom stay long?
My mom stayed for a season and then went back to Brazil. Now she is a U.S. citizen, and she lives with my brother. She's with my brother and my sister. They all live in Central Florida now.
Okay.
So all my family is in Florida. All my immediate family is in Florida.
Yeah. The great free state of Florida.
The great free state of Florida, yeah. Saint DeSantis, as I call him, yeah.
Nice, yeah. Well, that's cool, man.
Yeah.
So you guys get married, and then do you go straight into ministry after that, or what was the transition there?
Good question. I finished our college degree, and we took a year off where I worked and she worked. That was a difficult first year because we were sort of ships passing through the night. She had a different time. I was working a different schedule, and so that was a difficult first year. Nevertheless, God was very gracious. We knew where we were going. The seminary thing, the Masters of Divinity aspect was very unique. At that time I had developed a great affection for Dr. R.C. Sproul, and another gentleman who was instrumental in my thinking was Dr. O. Palmer Robertson, who's written lots of books on the covenant. That's sort of his expertise. Both of them had moved to South Florida to a seminary that was starting called Knox Theological Seminary, the late Dr. D. James Kennedy. And I thought, two of my heroes are in South Florida. So I began the application process to Knox Theological Seminary. What happened, Matthew, was that just about the same season, Dr. O. Palmer Robertson decided to go back to Africa to continue his missionary work. And Dr. R.C. Sproul had a stroke, which essentially took him out of Knox Theological Seminary. So the two men that I wanted to sit under were out of the picture almost immediately. And so at that point, Knox lost its appeal to me. And another seminary, which was far closer, which was Reformed Theological Seminary, sort of the magnum opus of seminary, the largest Reformed Presbyterian seminary in the world. They had their main campus in Orlando. I had not considered until Knox did not work out. And I had great appreciation for John Frame, who was a professor that I've always admired. And I remember getting a haircut the night before, preparing to sit in John Frame's office. It was kind of my first introduction. This is 2003, 2004. My first introduction to these sort of heavyweight, the prestigious seminary professors. At that moment, I had just read them from afar. But I went to Dr. Frame's office, and he's very unassuming, just a very jolly old man. And so we talked for about 45 minutes. And after that conversation, I said, I knew that RTS was the place for me to go in Orlando. And so we moved to Orlando, I think in early 2004, and began what was 4 years of just the most, certainly theologically prosperous season of my life, where I just delved into all the things that I wanted to delve into. I always tell folks a seminary is a young man's game. We didn't have kids at the time, but it required sort of your life and soul, body and blood. And I would arrive on campus at around 7 o'clock in the morning, usually the first one, and usually the last one to leave. I was just so intrigued by the academic world. I loved every moment of it. And Melinda was just a wonderful encouragement to me in that season. She taught at a classical school. She taught at a very prestigious classical school called Geneva Academy, which was also incidentally founded by R.C. Sproul. And so R.C. Sproul's name is sort of very much imprinted in a lot of elements of my life. We attended St. Andrew's Chapel for a season before I ended up doing an internship elsewhere. So we got to spend time with Dr. Sproul, sit under his teaching for a season as we were trying to figure out where we would stay. And so that was a wonderful beginning of 4 years of theological training in Orlando.
And was that Melinda's job at Geneva, was that your first introduction to classical Christian
Great question.
education?
Undoubtedly, my first introduction to classical education.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly. And I remember the first day that she was there for a teacher's gathering, a very well-known professor, got up and did a speech that I still remember to this day, where he gave this spontaneous, non-scripted speech that lasted about 10 minutes, where he quoted William F. Buckley, Ronald Reagan, Seneca, the Iliad, Calvin, Luther, all the way up to Abraham Kuyper, all of them in a concise 10 minutes. And I thought, that is remarkable. That is remarkable. Well, little did I know that most of my life would be in this classical ecosystem. But that was the beginning, and my wife, of course, benefited so much from it. And now, as someone who's been, who have children in classical schools and who has homeschooled through classical curriculums, obviously that was a wonderful preparation for everything we did after that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Very neat. Yeah. So you're in seminary, you end up in a pastoral internship?
I did. I was in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, it's the largest conservative Presbyterian denomination. Most people don't know this, but there are, I think, 24 Presbyterian denominations in the United States. Mm-hmm. The PCA is the largest conservative version of that. And it was a wonderful 7 years in the PCA. So I served as a pastoral intern in a PCA church literally next door to Disney World. And I served there for 3 years, a very long pastoral internship, but they took good care of me. They paid me well, and I served the congregation for 3 years, virtually as the only pastoral candidate there. The pastor, who became a good friend of mine, was there for a year and then resigned. And so for the next 2 years, I practically led this church by myself, finding people to fill the pulpit at times, teaching at times, do administrative work. It was a complete package. I could never have conceived of a pastoral internship that was so thorough. And all of it didn't happen. It didn't happen because it was natural, but precisely because it was unnatural. It prepared me for administrative things, for pastoral responsibilities, for preaching and teaching. And those were 3 great years of my life, and going through seminary as well. And so the combination was just very, the harmony of it was certainly providential, but it was also one of those harmonies that sort of have to function in a particular way for it to make sense. And it did. We traveled an hour to church every Sunday, but that 1 hour was never overly tedious. It was something that we knew we were called to do, and that was a stage of life. I very much contemplated staying in the PCA even after that, but there's a little place in Pensacola that drew my heart.
And so, yeah, I definitely want to talk about that, obviously. But I'm just thinking about being this pastoral intern and all the responsibilities that you're doing there at the church, as well as all the seminary responsibilities. Yes. That must have, and maybe you just have a natural propensity for this. But I think about how busy your schedule is now and how you manage all of that. Seems like this was another step along the way of preparing you for that.
Well, I've never read books on productivity too much later in life, but I've always had a productivity DNA. It's been just the concept of producing and being effective and persevering has also always been part of the way God sort of built me. And you're right. It required a lot of energy, and as I said earlier, it is a young man's game. I can't even fathom doing that with 2 or 3 kids. But we didn't have any children at the time. But God was sort of equipping me, but very much in complementary fashion too. So the things I was doing in seminary was being played out at the church level, and the thing I was doing at the church level was also influencing my seminary training and education. And that combined with what I call the golden age of Reformed Theological Seminary, which I am convinced that it was between the years 2004 and 2008. This was the post-R.C. Sproul years. R.C. Sproul had left because of some brouhaha with a professor named Richard Pratt. And so the divisive nature of that particular debate was gone. And so the seminary was at a place of peace, but the professors who were there were also top-notch. Bruce Waltke, Richard Pratt, the great Simon Kistemacher, who wrote virtually all New Testament commentaries, and John Frame, of course, was there. And we had a host of professors who came on a regular basis, Dr. Sinclair Ferguson, who I'd spent a lot of time with, Mark Futato, the great, iconic Hebrew professor who's written most of the Hebrew stuff for Logos software. And there was just this wealth of teaching. that I thought, this can't get any better. And those golden years were just what I needed. God was just putting together this incredible team of professors that would sort of shape the way I think about reality. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about some of those classes. There is a kind of diminishment of seminary education today, and there's validity to that. A lot of seminaries have compromised, but I got to tell you, I am a strong believer in seminary education as the preparatory model, the traditional seminary education as the preparatory model for pastoral ministry, because the combination of ecclesiastical work and the academy allows young men to submit at the feet of godly, older, more responsible, and more academically gifted men. That ability to sit at their feet is a preparation for later on to shepherd people. And so one of the things I've seen over the years is that those who have not gone through this traditional, and obviously there are exceptions, I grant that, but when people talk about the exceptions, the exceptions are always titans, right? Charles Spurgeon. I said, well, let's be honest. You're not Charles Spurgeon. You'll never be. But the traditional pastor who's gone through that seminary education, to sit under people, to submit under people, is a great preparation to lead people later on. I have found that people who transition from positions of leadership to positions of leadership struggle to see that dynamic, what it is to shepherd people and to care for people at different stages of life. And so I'm incredibly grateful for that traditional classical seminary 4-year Master's of Divinity, which is a sort of a law degree for theology. It was a long 106 credits, but I can honestly say that I loved every moment of it. I really did.
Once again, God's providence in preparing you for providence.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But that model that you speak of, the traditional seminary model, that's not the model of the CREC, or is it?
The model of the CREC is that seminary training is expected, but it's not required. Now, in most Presbyterian denominations, they make exceptions. In the CREC, we've made some more exceptions so that people can sort of have this kind of a la carte training. So let's say a typical candidate in CREC who has not gone through the traditional 4-year seminary. They have gone, maybe they've done a Theopolis Institute course. Maybe they've gotten some additional training at an online seminary. And so there's a kind of, there's an ability to combine different things. But the one thing that's required in the CREC is a 1-year pastoral internship. And by and large, in most cases, languages are required. And so, nevertheless, a lot of that's changing. The reason the CREC was a bit more flexible is because when you're small, you got to be flexible. But what's happening over the years, as the more we've grown denominationally, we become more structured. When the PCA was small, they were flexible. But as they've grown, they became more structured. CREC, the same thing is happening. I always tell people, everything is cute when you have only one kid. Everything is cute. Your sense of order is cute, right? The things you allow that your kid to do, everything is cute. But when you add more kids in the picture, if you don't have structure and boundaries and things that organize your day, your household will become chaotic. And the same thing functions at institutional or at the local level, right? There was a season in our church life where everybody knew what they had for dinner on Friday night. We were small. But as we grow, if we don't put some structural pieces there, everything falls apart. There is a romanticization of institutional life that I think is very much need to be done away with. When nobody likes hierarchy, nobody likes structure until it's necessary. And when it becomes necessary, realize, oh, how have we lived without it for so long? And I think at an institutional level, our denomination, CREC, is getting to the point now where now we have officially our first seminary, MDiv seminary, which is face-to-face residential, which is Greyfriars in Moscow, Idaho, which is doing really well. They just began their first year. And now we have officially an online seminary for those who can't move to Moscow, Idaho, which is Reformed Evangelical Seminary. So I think the CREC is becoming, I think, the kind of organizational denomination that a lot of Reformed denominations have gone through as well. Nevertheless, there's still plenty of men who come later in life. Maybe they were in the business world for many years and found their calling later in life. That the seminary education is not required. There's a way of sort of molding that to the point where we can get them through the ordination process without having to have a 4-year degree.
Sort of a hybrid approach.
From a hybrid approach, exactly, yeah.
So you would argue, I mean, you've just argued that that's a better model than just say you have people in your local congregation that you're training up that you would train to serve the church. It's better to send them off and have them attend the structured seminary.
Yes. Well, and the ideal scenario would be that they are serving the local church and attending a seminary at the same time, hopefully even something local. That's the ideal scenario. Sometimes that's just not possible. But at least in our case, our denomination has grown so much that if somebody goes to Moscow, there are 9 CREC churches. If they want to do the online program, they can stay here and serve as an intern at our local church and do a Theopolis Institute or do RES. So the possibilities have increased dramatically now. But I think, overall, because I have sat in examining committees a lot over the last 17 years, it's just the inevitability of it and the conspicuous nature of it that those who are seminary trained always do far better than those who are kind of the autodidacts, because seminary provides something else. Not only does it provide the ability to sort of sit under the instruction of men and to humble yourself before men who are wiser than you, but seminary also allows you to grasp theological categories, not only biblical theology, but systematic theology, in a way that you just can't do at a kind of an informal environment. So now at a seminary level, you're able to grasp what Reformed theology has taught from a broader perspective than just simply your little idiosyncrasies or your little preferences, right? You're getting a big picture, and those categories are helpful theologically, not only to expound theological things, but also to counsel theological people, right? Every individual created in the image of God is a theological person. But now, because you have categories, you can actually counsel them in a unique way, and as opposed to just tailoring to what they expect of you. You can speak very clearly and objectively in a way that I think demands attention from the counselee and demands attention from the parishioner as well. I think there's always a high degree of regard for those who have a good grasp of these categories, because it also allows them to engage contemporary issues, right? And those who are sort of trained in the spare of the moment, or who have gone through their podcast training, those people live in the moment. But a traditional seminary education, granted, under conservative sort of categories, allows you to grasp categories, and that means you can engage not only the past, not only the present, but future issues that will arise within the context of the church.
And the seminary graduates, they still go through the same ordination process.
Same ordination process. Everybody must go through the dreadful ordination process. Again, these things all change. I've sat through various examining committees, and here's what I love about the CREC. What I love about our examinations, opposed to other examinations in other traditions that I've been a part of, the CREC, the examiners, the committee that's examining you, has a distinct interest in your piety and your personal life. And to be honest, Matthew, that was not my experience in previous traditions, where the interest was fundamentally in theological, historical categories. But the CREC spends a large chunk of the, I think, 5 or 6 categories we cover on your piety. What is your devotional life? Is your wife interested in pursuing pastoral ministry, or is this just one of your, desires? Are your children walking with the Lord, if you have any? Do you have are you capable of organizing your way in such a way that you don't dismiss or forsake your family, that the church doesn't become your bride, And so these are questions that are really, really important. What are your habits, your entertainment? Even the last examination, one of the examiners said, when was the last time you looked at porn? These are heavy issues, very heavy issues. And now you're having to deal with the gravity of the calling, as opposed to merely the intellectual nature of the calling, which, by the way, is a significant part, but far more minor in the long scale than the pastoral responsibilities. Whatever, I tell this to all my interns, and certainly the pastoral students that I've taught over the last many, many years. If your assumption is that 40 to 60 hours of your week will be spent in some locked room with a code, reading books all day, I say, you have not fallen in love with pastoral ministry. You have fallen in love with a stereotype. you'll fall in love with an intellectualized version of pastoral ministry. Most of pastoral work is theological, but not theological in the sense you think it is. Theological in the sense that God has created us male and female. He has created everyone as an image bearer, and image bearers are in need to be drawn closer to Jesus Christ. And your responsibility is to use the knowledge and the intellect that God has given you and the pastoral insights that he has given you through the apostolic tradition and the apostolic writings to bring people closer to Jesus. And that happens in the hospital room, on the deathbed, that happens in the wedding ceremony, in the funeral, that happens in every place. I remember distinctly one day where I did a wedding in the morning, and then from there I went to the hospital to bless a little infant that was just born. And then in the evening, I attended a funeral, and I spoke at that funeral. And I thought, virtually all the stages of life are here in that one day. Pastoral ministry is like that, but it's spread out. And if your intellect is not used primarily for the good of the people, it will be actually a detriment to the people.
The pastor, in order to shepherd the sheep, has to be among the sheep, not in isolation.
Yes.
And just academic pursuits.
That's exactly. I can't remember if it was A.W. Tozer, and I've heard this story. I don't know if it's a legend, but I remember one of these older pastors who would preach, and there was a door right behind him that he said, essentially, I've done my duty, now it's time to go. And I think that kind of philosophy of ministry is destructive. Certainly, we all agree with that. But it's also a philosophy of ministry that's kind of been inculcated in certain pastoral worlds. And it's one that needs to be rejected. It needs to be completely desecrated like a pagan icon.
Yeah. So we're talking about things within the CREC, but let's take a step back and tell me, what is the CREC?
Okay. Well, I can say with a certain level of authority. The CREC, which stands for the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, has been in existence since 1998. It was formed because 3 churches in the Pacific Northwest had an interest to align themselves because of evangelistic interest, because of theological interest, to align themselves and no longer be independent. So the CREC began as a movement away from independent status like churches. And they said, we don't like this idea of being alone. Let's form a little community, a little gathering, a confederation of churches whereby we can do ministry together and share our life together as pastors and congregations. And so that began in 1998. And shortly thereafter, there was a couple of other churches that took interest in the Northwest as well. And then churches in Texas, and then the process has grown. And so the CREC is a communion of Reformed churches, and by Reformed I mean the Protestant Reformation, not just the 1517 variety, but also the Continental, the Puritan variety, the London Baptist variety. And by evangelical, we mean the evangelistic zeal to see people come to Jesus, right? It's a missiological zeal as well, but it's fundamentally an evangelistic zeal. We're evangelical in the sense that we are compelled by the evangel, by the gospel, by the good news. And so we want to keep these 2 categories in mind, not just sort of intellectual things to articulate, but also ways of living. We're reformational, but we're also evangelistic. And that means that we proclaim the glory of God, the salvation of God, the sovereignty of God, and at the same time, we're praying that people are going to be saved. We're praying that God will bring a great revival in all the earth. We pray that the Great Commission will be fulfilled. And so that's what the CREC is. I'll say one more thing. The CREC has also created a kind of unique ethos. And the ethos falls into these, what I call the 3 pillars of the CREC, which is the culture, the theology, and the liturgy. The culture carries a very distinct sense of hospitality. That's the part where I think most people see that almost immediately when they come to one of our churches. But then that leads the way to the theological distinctives that we have, which are fairly distinct, I grant that. Postmillennial eschatology, the practice of paedo communion, all these kind of predestination, that kind of thing. And then the final pillar, which is significant, is the liturgical pillar. That means if you walk into our churches, you will see, you'll see pastors wearing clerical collars, but also pastors wearing ties. That's not the main issue. But there's a liturgical, orderly dimension to how we worship that is fundamentally different from the kind of spontaneity that you see in broader evangelical services that sort of make things up on the spot and they believe that they're being led by the Spirit to do these things. We also believe we're being led by the Spirit, but I don't think the Spirit works divorced from preparation, but he works through the preparation of his people. And so these are the three pillars. And what I have found fascinating is wherever I've traveled, I think I was doing some calculations recently, around 45 to 50 CREC churches in the United States and the world. That level of cohesiveness is found whether you walk into a church in Tokyo, Japan, or you walk into a church in Huntsville. And I love that level of harmony and cohesiveness. And that's one of the things that attracts me so much about the CREC.
Yeah. I think you and I may have done a video on why the clerical collar.
I think we did. I think we did it. Yeah, I remember at the Northminster Presbyterian.
That's right.
At a PCUSA church, a liberal mainline church. And there we were talking about holy things.
Yeah, that was good. So if people have an interest in why, they can find that on your channel.
They can find it on my channel, yeah. A quick 2-minute summary. There you go. Yeah.
So with the number of denominations, a person might say, we have all these denominations already. You mentioned there's 24
Presbyterian, just in the United States. Yeah.
So why one more?
Why one more? Well, I would argue that one more because of a couple of distinct theological things, but one more because a couple of distinct cultural things, and one more because of a couple of distinct liturgical things. In most Reformed traditions, you have a certain level of harmony, but it's very clear that they differ in very obvious ways. When I was in the PCA, I could go to Willow Creek Presbyterian, which was 5 minutes from where I lived, and it would be virtually a rock concert in the PCA church. Or I could go to St. Paul's, which was 30 minutes from where I lived in Orlando, which is a church I still very much cherish, St. Paul's Presbyterian, and there would be a choir piece opening the service in Latin, right? Two very, very radical worlds. The concept of hospitality was also very divergent. The concept of theological unanimity was centered on the Westminster Confession of Faith, but depending on the exceptions you took, that could vary significantly. For example, in the PCA, there was a report done a decade plus where they articulated that 11 positions on creation were acceptable, 11 of them. Among them, the day-age theory, the framework theory, the young earth position, and various others in between. Well, some people may think these are they're not issues that carry gravitas. Well, the CREC thinks differently about these things, and we're always concerned about the shifting of alliances, the shifting of the culture, the shifting of what's happening in our society, in the politics, in the ecclesiology, whatever it might be. And because of that, we have treasured certain things above others. And issues like creation are very significant to us. And so in the CREC, if you believe in theistic evolution, there's no room for you. If you believe in day-age theory, there's no room for you. We subscribe explicitly to a young earth creationist paradigm. There's poetry in the first chapter of the Bible, the second chapter of the Bible. There's poetry throughout the scriptures, but it doesn't mean we eliminate the historicity of Genesis. And so we're going to keep these things in perspective. We also have a very dogmatic understanding of how male leadership works in the church. And so in our congregation, only males do all the liturgical elements of service. And so these things, as you can imagine, would cause enormous turmoil in any other Reformed tradition, certainly the Dutch and the PCA and in many other traditions. And so these are distinct things that you find in the CREC, coupled with a culture that treasures hospitality, biblical authority, that treasures male leadership, that treasures a distinct understanding of how men and women ought to relate to one another, that treasures biblical courtship, that treasures marriage, that treasures lots of kids. People have always said that the best way to identify a CREC church is how many 15-passenger vans there are in the parking lot. We have lots of them. So never be fooled by a CREC church with 150 people. You may think, man, that's a pretty big crowd there. It may be only like 6 families.
Yeah.
You know? We have lots of babies, and we believe in the perpetuation of them on earth. We like them a lot. People always say, you know, some people have said in the media, I can't imagine bringing children into this world. Well, I can't imagine not.
Yeah.
This is, our children are made for such a time as this.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah, that's good. So what is your role, Uri, in the CREC now?
Well, in 2023, the year of our Lord, in Moscow, Idaho, a little town that virtually no one knew about 10 years ago, but now it's in the center of attention of the whole country.
That it is, yeah.
Yeah, Moscow without the cow. It's just Moscow, not Moscow. It's in a different part of the world. Moscow, Idaho, and we had the General Council. Our denomination meets together. We have 9 presbyteries, and that covers Europe, Asia, South America. 9 presbyteries. All 9 presbyteries, which represents the entire denomination, gathers once every 3 years, called the General Council, in a particular place. In 2023, it was in Moscow, Idaho. So we had the delegates represented our churches present there. And in 2023, I was voted unanimously as a new presiding minister of council. And the role of presiding minister of council means that I represent the denomination. In some ways, I function as kind of an ambassador of the denomination. And so that means I get to travel on behalf of the denomination. I get to speak on behalf of the denomination. I get to write statements on behalf of the denomination. I wrote a statement when Donald Trump was elected where I thanked God for the election of Donald Trump. And it was the first time where I felt the fury of the online folks. And so these are statements that I get a chance to write on behalf of the denomination. So I get the responsibility of it, and it was certainly daunting in the beginning, but I also realized that the denomination wants to go a certain direction, so that my role is not so much to reinvent the CREC, but to make sure we're all going together in the same direction. So when I do radio interviews, when I do online interviews, or even interviews in studios, I get to talk about it, and I get to emphasize the things that I treasure. So it's a difficult job in the sense that I'm out a lot, and my congregation has been remarkably patient. I have the privilege of taking my family with me in many of these occasions, so it's a real blessing there to take my family to places I never thought I would go to. Never thought I'd be in Tokyo, Japan, and taking my family with me. But nevertheless, it's not hard in the sense that I get to talk about the things that I truly love. And I firmly believe in the mission of CREC. I firmly believe in it. Many years ago, there was a survey sent out to CREC churches to determine where our children were after they graduate high school. And it was an incredibly high, now granted, we're small, it's a little easier to do a survey, small denomination, but it was something like 94% of our children end up not only as Christians after they graduate college, but they remain in CREC churches. And the level of apostasy was sort of less than 1%. The other 5% were in different churches. And so we are 27 years old, and at this stage in our history, we're able to test our theory, right? In the beginning, you get momentum, you get excitement and thrill, but 27 years later, now we get to test our theory. Are our children and our children's children worshiping together? And I'm really happy to say that they are. In fact, last Sunday I preached on Ecclesiastes about that merger between old age and young age, and how Solomon describes old age and the exhortations ought to give to youth. And I made the observation that some of you here in the congregation are sitting with your children's children on Sunday morning. And a very dear older lady came up to me afterwards. I think you made a mistake. I said, what happened? What did I say wrong? She said, I am worshiping with my children's children's children on Sunday morning. So 4 generations in the same congregation.
What a blessing.
It really is a blessing. And not many churches can say that, but many of our churches in CREC who've been around for a while now can make these really, really wild and blessed assertions.
Yeah, that's really cool. So how do you as the Prime Minister of Council or Presiding Minister of Council, how does the CREC maintain this unity and uniformity across churches from Japan to Alabama?
Well, the first one is by making a lot of people mad. Yeah. You cannot remain a cohesive denomination if you don't make people mad. What I loved about the CREC, let me just be really direct here, especially about the labors of Douglas Wilson, who needs to be honored, is that from the beginning, I think he set the stage, even though he doesn't play any major role in the CREC, but he plays a major role as a, sort of an iconic elder at the gate kind of figure to whom we listen to in many, many of these issues, especially in our day. But he set the stage early on, and the stage was the following. If I get a role speaking at Ligonier Conference, if I get a role speaking at a political dinner, if I cannot speak what I believe to be true and good, then let that be my last time speaking at these places. And I have followed that model in all the things I've done in D.C., in politics locally, at church events and conferences. And I think not just me, but a lot of people follow that model. So when the stage is set early on that a position at the table is not something you're desiring or looking to as the ultimate goal, if your desire is not to please particular constituents, that means you can speak truthfully and even forcefully. And that also means that you never have to apologize for anything in the Bible. Never. And so when atheists or even evangelicals begin to question certain things about why the CREC only has male leadership, some of us can take the time to answer it, but most of us can simply say, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in that conversation because it's been settled already. It's been settled. So when you don't want a place at the table, that frees you to talk about the Neanderthal position of young earth creationism, right? Which is completely mocked in our society. Yes, there was a worldwide flood. And what of it if you mock me with your statistics? Or what if you mock me with particular details that came out of Science Journal today that will most certainly be changed 3 years from now? None of these things affect you. And so there is a cohesiveness of mission, but also a determination of mission that allows you to be truthful to the Word of God, truthful to your people, truthful to your calling, without ever having to pause and say, am I offending this person? And that gives you actually an incredible amount of confidence, greater confidence even still when you're doing your work.
Yeah. What do you think has surprised you most about being in this role?
What surprised me most is that I drink a lot more bourbon than I thought I would. You find yourself in very unique places in Washington, D.C., and you find yourself in places with wonderful people, and you always find yourself around food and drink, and you find yourself having conversations that you never imagined having. Like I never thought I would give an invocation at a gala in honor of J.D. Vance. I never thought that I would be in a place in D.C. where environmentalist wackos would invade the facility. And I never imagined that I would have a platform, a viral video of me praying in public. And these are things that you don't imagine that you're being with these people. What I've discovered, and I talk about the bourbon as a way of just simply saying, I never imagined that I'd be in positions or in places where there'd be so many transformational, influential people. And you find yourself and you realize that if you're just yourself, even though our denomination is small, if you are yourself and you speak the things that to be true, that what I realize is that liberal or conservative will respect that more so than if you were to sort of tailor your message to a particular audience. And so it doesn't matter where I am, if I'm eating at a $50,000 table in D.C., and generally the food is horrendous, by the way. I much prefer the chicken wings that are served afterwards. But it doesn't matter where you're seated with a tuxedo, people will honor the confidence you have in your convictions rather than your ability to sort of play the political game where your message is changing at every avenue or every venue.
Yeah. You think people are actually hungry for authenticity, whether they agree with you or not?
I think in our day, I've yet to meet someone who has said, when I get to pray at NatCon every year, and it's led by an Orthodox Jewish scholar, philosopher named Dr. Yoram Hazony, I remember the first time I offered a Protestant invocation. I'm just telling you how it goes typically. The rabbi gets, it sounds like a pub joke, but it's not. The rabbi walks in and then he does his invocation, and it's fairly tailored to all religions. The Catholic walks in and he does his invocation, always very brief. And it's usually something that's pre-written, right? Something really beautiful, but it's very short and concise. When I do my invocation, I use it as an opportunity to offer about a 5 to 7 minute homily. And so I get to quote people that I cherish. And it's the invocation where I get to offer imprecations, where I can speak out boldly against leftist policies in D.C., where I can say virtually whatever I want. And what I told the organizers is, at the moment you muzzle anything I have to say, it'll be the last time I'll ever be here. And what I have found when I do these things is that both Jews and Gentiles, unchristians, unbelievers, have come up to me and express incredible gratitude for my boldness. And even from an Orthodox Jew, I remember hearing them say to me many times, what I appreciate about you that you're Protestant and you're not shy about it. And I have always been, I have discovered that has been a much more successful model than the other models that I've seen experienced in political scenarios where there is a capitulation to the things to be true because they want to tailor to an individual, a particular audience or a particular special group, you know? And so I've found that there has been always a gratitude for my conviction as opposed to a, what do you think you're doing kind of attitude. And so I've continued to do it. And until, as long as they let me, I'll continue to use these opportunities as I see fit.
Yeah. While we're on the topic of politics, what do you make of this sort of political environment, political and cultural moment that we're in?
Every season goes through, this is sort of Ecclesiastes 3 category, but life is seasonal, life is cyclical, and politics tends to mirror our individual lives as well. History is being sanctified just as our individual lives is being sanctified. And because of these seasons, we can expect a shifting of attention, a shifting of focus, a shifting of emphases from different voters. And so we are at a stage in history right now where I think Gen Zs and millennials will be, I think, 50% of the electorate in the next election cycle. That's pretty significant. And the questions they're asking is certainly not the questions our grandfathers were asking. And with the old James Carville, it's the economy is stupid, plays very little role in the way they think about it. I think most people are thinking about the economy, that is a very tertiary issue. I think the culture wars have come to a prominent place. The same culture wars that the moral majority fought in the 80s with Jerry Falwell are essentially the same culture wars fought today with a bunch of additional layers added to it, right? So when we talk about homosexuality now, there's layers, LGBTQ+. When you talk about the issues regarding, regarding abortion, there are layers now to it. There are layers now because of the overthrow of Roe v. Wade. Now you're having to strategize at different levels. And I think there has to be an adjustment by the current sort of political powers. We have to adjust and answer questions that are being asked today, not the questions asked in the era of Ronald Reagan. The nuclear crisis is a crisis now that's that shift has ended. America is certainly the superpower of the world. We are also indebted to the whole world. That's a separate conversation. But we are the superpower. It's very clear that Donald Trump has established himself as a superpower. The nations look to the United States. And so our concerns are going to be different. But I think if the church doesn't take a preeminent role in being outspoken about what our priorities ought to be, other institutions will take that role. And that's what's happened. It happened during the Obama era, it happened during the Clinton era, and happened even during the Jimmy Carter era, going back to the late 70s. And then fast forward to this era of Kamala Harris, AOC, Mondami, and all these new figures that are rising. And so the church needs to be at the forefront of these things. And because we have capitulated to these things, other institutions have spoken on behalf of the church. The shift has happened during the years 2020, 2023, where the churches were allowing institutions to speak for them, and they all shut down. and the ones that didn't shut down sort of built what I call a muscular liturgy, a form of capacity to endure attacks, a capacity to endure the manipulation of the government. And so these churches are the ones sort of taking a preeminent role in society and in cultural issues. And so we need to once again go back to the blank slate and ask the questions. What are Gen Zers asking? What are the questions they're asking? And they're asking very unique questions. But now we need to address them, and we need to be very bold about it. And at the point we give in to the demands of a certain generation who now view things like LGBTQ as as part and parcel of who they are, if we don't confront these things, we will have another 8, 10, 15 years of compromised churches. And so I think there has been an awakening of evangelical churches to speak much more truthfully to these things. And I find that really compelling. Obviously, it led to the 2024 election of Donald J. Trump, and Lord willing will lead to the election of whoever's next in 2028.
Yeah. Do you see that momentum continuing?
I see the momentum continuing. I see it in D.C. I see it with the national conservative movement. I see it with the populist movement. I see it with the rising figures within the Republican Party, whether it be, I know Marco Rubio has been around for a while, but I think he's a rising figure with much more prominence today. Certainly with J.D. Vance, I think in many ways, what he carries is the future of the Republican Party. That kind of populist, American first sort of model, I think is significant to be carried in an age where we have abandoned American interests to concern ourselves with interests of other nations. And I think that the surrounding figures, we always pray for a multitude of counselors. We know, the thing about Donald Trump, we know what his flaws are. And so if you have a man who is deeply flawed, right, and I think he's changed dramatically even since 2016, but still a flawed man, as we all are, but he's just flawed in a different kind of way. If you have a flawed man who's pushing our agenda, we need to have a multitude of counselors around him who are pushing distinctly our agenda. So divided in two categories, there's our general agenda, which is the good of America, the destruction of leftist policies. And then there's our distinct agenda, which is the lordship of Jesus over government. That is being propounded and proclaimed by people in positions of government that I have never seen in my 30 years of engagement in political issues. And so we live certainly in a new age. Obviously, social media has made that a little easier to digest and has complicated that in various ways. Nevertheless, I think we are living in an era where I can foresee, again, unless the church gives up their ability to speak truthfully these things, if it continues in this process and this trajectory, I can foresee 8, 12, 16, 20 years, if not longer, of a hegemony of power in the right direction, leading in the right direction. And I'm very encouraged by that. And in a very, very small way, I'm happy to be a part of that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also see this moment where, recently Charlie Kirk was martyred.
Yeah.
And it seemed like that produced a large awareness of church by people who weren't in church before, and people having a desire for Bibles and God's Word and that sort of church fellowship. Do you feel like we're in a moment of revival? Do you feel like these are legitimate, interests? Are they just a passing because of what's happened and they'll fade quickly, or what do you make of that moment?
It has certainly served as a moment of revival. I think the day of Charlie Kirk's memorial service, I think, I've made this statement on Twitter, that was the largest pro-gospel, even, let me go further, pro-Trinitarian service in terms of numerically and how far it reached that has ever happened in the history of civilization, undoubtedly. It would make Billy Graham seem a minute figure in history, right? Things that not even the Apostle Paul dreamed of reaching, right? The Apostle Paul established the roots, but he never imagined the gospel going to millions and millions and millions of people. And I got to say, that whole service it went from glory to glory. And I cannot speak more highly of what happened that day. I'm just very grateful to all of that. I think what's taking place today is certainly a reorientation of visions or reorientation of particular structures. I think there has been a a reunification of conservatism around certain ideals. And as long as it pursues this reunification, which has been fantastic since the martyrdom of Charlie, is we have 2028 in our pockets. The great danger, of course, is when we have now pockets within this unified group who are starting to feel like they have to start their own tribe, start their own movement, start their own way of looking at the world. And by doing so, they begin to cause fraction and friction within the conservative movement. And so these particular tendencies are tendencies towards radical and revolutionary directions that would not lead to a conservation of Western ideals, but the destruction of Western ideals. And so if you think about the fact that Christian virtues established the West, if you remove the Christian virtues, what will happen to the West, right? Even if you say, well, we have to put aside these virtues for the good of the party, right? That's not how history works. That's not how history works. You can always find temporary victories when you remove virtues. But we don't want temporary victory. We want lasting victories. And so if these voices don't take the prominence of the party, if they remain merely sort of voices that we can put on the side and make them footnotes of footnotes, if we can do that, we'll survive 2028 and we'll continue to prosper. But if our unification begins to fracture because of them, and that what we're going to have is the rise of even Mondami-like figures, whereas he may not be tolerated in 2028, but if he continues a certain trajectory, he may be tolerated in 2032. And that's the problem, is that guys like Mondami are entering into the political scene, obviously through the force of social media, through the force of New York, right? They're going to do everything that you expect in New York City. But even there's been a changing. So guys like that, they're initially acceptable in places where their brand is acceptable. But if the nation begins to go a certain direction, now they become acceptable at a national level. And that happens if our party begins to digest this kind of cynical reality that many people want to embrace. And as you've seen my work over the years, I want to see some of these things expelled and excommunicated from our party as soon as possible, so they don't take any, so they don't have even a 0.01% of influence.
How do we do that?
We do that again by speaking boldly from pulpits, by speaking boldly in our social media platforms, and by realizing that when people say that the only way to bring more people in is by listening to these fringe voices, right? We have to bring the youth in because they are the next generation. But the reality is, first of all, I don't think most of the youth is a reflection of that. And what I have seen, the CREC, is that, I'll give an example, that our 8 to 10 largest churches in the CREC are churches that have made very strong statements on an opposing racist identitarianism, or opposing kinism, or opposing this form of really malevolent anti-Semitism. These churches have made these things we certainly have at Providence. And the reality is that our numbers have not begun to shrunk, but they've actually continued to grow, in some cases even double in size. So people are not looking for fringe. Fringe is what you find in certain spheres of Twitterdom, right? You find those there. When people are forming ecclesiastical virtual communities, you'll find these fringe groups there, and you will have the impression that that is what the country is drinking at large, when it's a minority of a minority. And so to me, this will be very controversial, but I want to say, stand by the older voices that have guided you here. Stand by those voices that lived through the Reagan Revolution, that lived through the moral majority, that lived through World War II, that there may be particular things they have done after the war that has caused some consternation in their offspring. Nevertheless, they set a model for bravery, courage, Americanism, patriotism. And these things ought to be emulated, imitated, rather than despised. And I think that's actually the future of the church. The future is not a new generation abandoning the past, but it's a new generation standing on the shoulders of our forefathers.
It always comes back to the church picking up the Kuyperian mantle,
Yeah.
speaking prophetically to the government and to the culture.
Yeah, it does. And I think where that voice has been silenced or muted, other voices come in. And so you begin to see very small compromises taking place. And nobody becomes an overnight liberal, right? Institutions, churches in particular, no church becomes an overnight leftist institution. They just make 1,000 of little compromises. And these compromises happen in the day-to-day, week-to-week, Lord's Day after Lord's Day. And before you know it, 10 years later, now you have elders in your congregation who are comfortable with the fact that their lesbian daughters, his lesbian daughter married another lesbian. And so I'm giving real life examples how these things are happening in traditionally conservative environments, but now they're happening. And so at that point, people have to make real important decisions. And that goes with something I said yesterday on social media, that there is a legitimate case for not just leaving that local church, but leaving the city, leaving the state as well, and traveling to Pensacola, Florida if necessary, traveling to Moscow, Idaho, to Fort Worth, Texas, to traveling to places where your offspring now has a chance of thriving, right? The idea of romanticizing your place has its place, but the idea of endangering your offspring does not have a place. And so you may have to move 2 hours away to find a better church, but don't stay in a church merely because you say, well, that's where grandma went to church. And I know they've changed. I know they've become really liberal, but maybe I can make a change here. Well, how long is that change going? How long will you try to make that change? And is there a time frame where that change is no longer viable? And when I realized that most people who have made that kind of statement have sold their soul to wokeism in the process, and instead of changing, they've been changed.
Along that thread of not endangering your children, as you know, my daughter's a senior.
Yeah.
Your daughter's graduating this year as well. How do you advise parents on next steps for children that are graduating and thinking about higher education? How do they protect those children from what could often be called maybe indoctrination camps?
Yeah, well, they are indoctrination camps. Well, first of all, is consider that very question. Consider what the college is. Consider what the university is. And just because you can get in for free, you may save $20,000 but lose your child's soul in the process, right? So gaining the world, we've realized since the days of the Gospels that there's no benefit in that, gaining the world, losing your soul. So contemplate, so do your homework. I've been encouraged over the years to have 3 to 5 colleges, even as your children are little, to begin contemplating 3 to 5 colleges. I know that's not always possible, but if it is possible, keep these colleges in mind. And so consider that, number one. And then consider whether college should be an option after all, right? Consider if that's a necessity. The idea of indebting yourself for the next 20 years it may be appealing to you as a parent, but may not be appealing to the husband of your daughter, 10 years down or 6 years down the road. So keep these things in mind. There are people who don't need to go to college. I remember interviewing Doug Wilson maybe 15 years ago and asking about college. And I said, Doug, it's very clear that the number of people going to college has diminished. What do you say about that? And he said, well, with God's help, those numbers will keep diminishing. Very Wilsonian line, isn't it? Yeah. And I thought, that's very interesting. I was a huge sort of advocate for furthering academic training, but he put that bug in my mind. Hasn't abandoned me since. I think there's that needs to be asked as well. Is this necessary? Is this really necessary to accomplish what I want to accomplish? Especially for young ladies, by the way, especially for young ladies.
Yeah, talk more about the young lady aspect of that.
Yes, I think every young lady graduating from high school ought to say to herself and to her parents, my desire is to be a stay-at-home mom and blessing my family with the gifts that God has given me. That should be fundamental. Fundamental. We have made the life of our young daughters throughout the evangelical world, we have told them that to be a professional woman is the ultimate goal, the ultimate goal. We have made them into Taylor Swift replicas, right? And as a result, we're losing our daughters. We're losing our daughters. And if they remain within the evangelical world, they have careers instead of children. The irony of the whole thing, Matthew, is that for all those who are more so in the feminist camp, right? We want to have this professional life. We want to stay away. We don't want the patriarchy. The reality is most of these women spend all their lives sitting under men who are their bosses and their leaders, right? So it's never a matter of what man will I submit to, or am I going to submit to a man? It's what man will you submit to? A husband who will cherish you, who will cleanse you, who will wash you with the water and the word, Ephesians 5, or some men out there who will be dictating things very often outside of biblical rationale. That said, there are seasons for everything, right? When we got married, my wife worked at a classical school, and thanks be to God, it provided quite a bit to pay my seminary bills. I was grateful to that, but we knew what we were doing. That when seminary was over and when I got my first job, that she would come home. And she has been ever since. But also we live in a day where I think there's a Proverbs 31 principle is women can be productive as well from the home. They can be beautifiers of the home and be productive, sometimes without a college education. What college can do, nevertheless, apart from helping find a husband, which is a very genuine option that most people don't think, people sort of diminish that value, but it's a good value to keep in mind. But what it can do is it can provide a good education for you to actually train your children at home, for you to homeschool your children. I think that's invaluable. I think that's very beneficial. And there may be seasons later on when your children are out of the home where you can, but college can also provide an opportunity for you to be a productive wife. If you have a business, your wife can be a great asset to your business. She is the one, I can't remember where I got this illustration from, but the wife should be always the one jumping on the trampoline so that you go higher and higher and higher. And so when she does not know or understand that her role is to be a woman who submits to her husband and who is a helpmeet of the highest order, who is a productive contributor to her own economy. If she doesn't view her role that way, then she will say, well, I should find work elsewhere, and the home is only secondary or tertiary. But remember, the word household is from the Greek oikos, which means the economy, right? And so the household is one economy. If husband and wife are not working for the benefit of that economy, which includes the stewardship of children, right? But if they're building two separate economies, which usually happens when women treat their lives as, would take the professional trajectory, these two economies work to the detriment of the central economy, which usually means, in our day, practically, that women are having fewer children. When they want to have children, they can only have very few. And has also led to the DINK generation, double income, no children. And as a result, these people are again, they're gaining the world, but losing their souls. They're dying in the isolation of their own existence. And so I want to encourage our young ladies to treasure what Paul says to Titus in Titus 3, to be makers of the home, beautifiers of the home, and to love that above everything else. If you love that first, there's plenty of flexibility for other things. But if that is out of order, then everything else will be out of order as well.
What about the young lady that has those proper affections and desires, doesn't want to go to college, but does want to find a husband?
Yeah.
What do they do?
Well, what they should do is they should be in churches and in communities where there are plenty of young men. Truly should that. I have encouraged young ladies to, if you're in the church where the average age is 76, you should go somewhere else to a young adults gathering. Find somewhere else to be, if necessary, find somewhere else to worship. Right? That's all these things I think are legitimate contemplations. In the CREC, we have the benefit of having all sorts of things around the country. We have summer camp, we call Summer Sanctus, and we have those in Texas and California. We also have Gloria Sanctus for 18 to 30-year-old, for young single adults to get to meet each other in a context that's relatively innocent, in the context of games, the context of pastoral liturgical training. That's also an option. But also we have dances all over the country, right? So we call these dances, and the dance floor is a wonderful metaphor for marriage. A man must go to a young lady and say, may I have this dance? He must reach out his hands first rather than she reaching out her hands. All these things are kind of liturgical, rhythmic practices for marriage. And so find places where these opportunities arise and and fathers should be accompanying these young ladies as often as it is possible. I have urged all sorts of things at a practical level. If you're out of high school and your daughter does not have an interest in going to college, she could take some courses. I want to keep her busy. So if there's a kind of gap year, keep her busy. Being busy might mean traveling a little bit. It also might mean that dad takes her to certain of his business endeavors as well. Places where she's able to meet other young men, and places where she's able to sort of develop also a sense of what kind of young men would be best, right, to guide her in the paths of righteousness. And so for a young lady who's looking to these situations, not interested in marriage, I would say develop a kind of a resume of what you should look for in a man. And then honestly, be in places where youth is a part of the DNA, where there's life, opportunities to engage under the tutelage and guidance of mature figures, parents and all that. And I think there's plenty of those opportunities around, but but these young ladies will have to go out of their comfort zones, and that means that passive dads are going to have to step up.
Yeah. What about the argument that one might say, yes, this lady is headed toward marriage. She wants to be a wife and a mother, but she needs a degree because what if the husband passes away, or she needs something to do until she finds her future spouse?
I think that's a legitimate argument if you lived in Tehran. A legitimate argument if you lived in in the Amazonian forest. Legitimate argument if you lived in places where poverty and the absence of jobs and the absence of creativity was prevalent. In the United States, that's not an argument at all. I don't think it's an argument at all. In other words, we don't form policies on the basis of potentialities. We don't form policies on the basis of exceptions. I think college is important. It can provide, but the majority of jobs that require skills and creativity are available. And today, if you have a little bit of creativity, which is why I think a classical education is so fundamental, right? Creativity in the classical school. I have heard, in fact, our speaker at New St. Andrews College was a very successful businessman who got his degree from New St. Andrews, who learned how to speak clearly, who learned how to be properly curious about the world, and who entered into this very heavy business world where everybody had a kind of business degree from prestigious institutions. And he went through this training season, he was telling the story, where he was certainly the one who with least qualifications. And at the end of the 7 days of training, he ended up becoming the one with the most qualified for that position. And now he has a very prestigious role in that organization. And not to speak of someone that both of us admire, David Bahnsen, right? So these opportunities are all there. And so I think that classical education is going to provide actually even more opportunities to supersede the market. The market has been in many ways dethroned because college has dethroned them. College, instead of building them up, has actually removed the categories of knowledge that they had. And so not all of them, obviously. Some colleges accentuate and build upon. Most do. They dethrone knowledge. And so as a result, you are dumber in the marketplace. And I think our young ladies, if they are to pursue jobs and if a husband were to die, will actually be in the position, if she is A, in a good community, and B, an environment where creativity is cherished and nourished, will be in a position where finding a job or making ends meet, also, of course, through the blessings of the church and the help of the congregation, where that is a reality. It's not just a potentiality; it's actually a reality. So I don't buy the argument, especially because we live in the most prosperous country on earth. And if you were to live in a country that is completely in need or in financial turmoil all the time, I think what typically happens in these countries is that college provides a level of security. It provides level of security, but usually at the expense of community. And so I would take community over financial security any day. And so I want to advocate the importance of college, but I also want to say it's not the telos of education. And I think if we can diminish that emphasis a bit more, what we're going to see as we go down the line is fewer women going to college and more men going to college. And what we have in the reason our college university systems are so feminized is because the majority of women are going to college and fewer men are going to college. So now you have a majority academic female staff. Now we have a majority administrative female staff. And all these things do trickle down. And I would say, by and large, that ought not to be the place for women to be in. Exceptions exist, Deborahs exist, but they're all exceptions. They're potentialities. In the scale of history, in the nature of redemptive history, they're not the norm by any stretch.
And you feel like, so we're heading toward a place where having to have the sheet of paper just to get you past the initial gatekeeper, that's becoming less and less. Like having to have the diploma to even have an opportunity for a job is diminishing.
Certainly. I think the ability to utter words without grammatical errors is a far more significant skill than anything else. And I've seen our young men in our church go to these places where they are not academically or on paper as qualified as others. But the first time they do one presentation, they exceed the expectations, and immediately they're given much. And so I think that's the nature of classical education, is that we've been given much, and to whom much is given, much is required. You have to use those skills well.
I agree. Yeah. The first time they have an interview, their skill and their virtue and their character is going to propel them above the other candidates.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if there's still roadblocks because in your application, you don't have, a degree attached to your resume.
Right.
Does that close a lot of doors still?
It may close some doors, but on the other hand, may open lots of other doors.
May not close doors that matter.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Maybe that's not a place you want to be if that's the only criteria.
Well, and I think speaking just for our denomination, CREC has sort of built a resume of very, very ambitious young men, right? They want to start podcasts, they want to start businesses together. And I appreciate that, but it has to be, their zeal has to be directed. But sometimes when certain doors are closed, what you do is you get together with other guys and say, what about this tech business? What about this mowing yards business? Or let's start a videography business together where we're doing videos of different events. And so the life of community and the life of camaraderie and the life of friendship and true masculinity allows young men, and perhaps even young ladies to a certain extent, but certainly young men, to be creative. If they lack creativity, there will always be someone who's going to come along and who's creative and is going to stir the non-creative towards creativity. And I think that's it. So you need these two combinations that I've expounded over the years. You need poets and practitioners, right? The practitioner will stand behind a zero-turn mower and will mow all day long, right? He wants to ask, how shall we then live? This is the Schaeffer question. How shall we then live? The poet's going to be reading John Donne, right? He's going to be sort of theologizing, and sometimes in the abstract. He's going to give you the big picture. But we all need each other, right? If the practitioner goes along without a vision, he's going to suffer to put things in place, right? There always has to be someone who gives life and a theme to the practitioner. That's what the poet does. If the poet's left alone, right? We know what happens when poets are left alone, right? They isolate themselves. They lose the sense of the practicality. They fall into this kind of Gnostic fog, and there's a real danger there as well. So the poet definitely needs the practitioner as well.
Well, Uri, that's such a helpful conversation. I think it'll be it's been fruitful for me. Yeah. I think it'll be fruitful for anyone that hears it. And it just reminds me, as we talked about several times, that it's really so important to just think about the community that you're in. So vital. And so that makes me think back to Providence and our communities that we've talked about. So tell me some more about how you ended up at Providence.
Providence, one of my profiles says something like husband of one, father of five, and pastor to the most hospitable congregation on planet Earth. I was in the Presbyterian Church of America for 7 years, as I said earlier, and it was a great community. I still have a great affection for the PCA, but there were theological convictions that were just causing me to move into different directions. And I wasn't looking for theological precision. I was looking for a certain kind of theological application that would allow me, at the time my wife was pregnant with Abigail, allow me to bring up my child and nurture that admonition of the Lord. And I needed to see consistency. I didn't want to be one voice speaking on behalf of Christian education, surrounded by 50 other voices that were contradicting me. I didn't want that message to be right there at the beginning. And so for that and another 100 reasons that we don't need to go into, I began to look officially into the CREC. Now remember, this is 2008. The time the CREC had around 25, 30 churches, maybe a little bit less, I don't recall. So we were very small. We were certainly didn't have any national attention. The only one who may have had some national attention was Douglas Wilson over very trivial things, honestly. But of course, he has started the classical school movement, both at the college level, but also at the high school level, the K through 12 level. So his influence was there, but it was very much behind the scenes. And so looking at the CREC was one of those things that I really had to contemplate deeply, because my convictions were aligned with the CREC, but I also knew that I had the concerns to provide for my family. And to be honest, the small little CREC didn't have the kind of retirement packages that the PCA did. PCA has been established for a very long time. And so that came to mind quite a bit. I was about to have my first child. Nevertheless, when I came here to visit here in Pensacola, this is 2008, when I came to visit and I spent time with some dear saints, all of whom you know, and we were part of they were celebrating, I think, we were having a wine tasting party. And we sang Christmas hymns, and we drank wine, and we had delicious food, and we fellowshiped. And I just remember telling my wife as we were heading back, I said, if they don't call me to this particular task here, if they don't extend me a call, maybe I'll volunteer. It was such a delightful experience I had here. And I envisioned at the time saying, this is a place where I want to make life happen. And that was just very important. Our congregation at the time had around 40 members. We were quite small, but again, a committed group of people, which you need that core group of people that are committed to the vision. And so that was the beginning of my time at Providence. In 2008, I was hired. I moved into town on January 1st of 2009. So I am in my 17th year now at Providence Church. Obviously, we've grown a little bit since then. God has
just 10x.
Just 10x, yeah. Exactly. That's exactly right. God has prospered our numbers, but He's also prospered our culture. And so we no longer have 140 families that are the 100. I think we have I can't remember exactly how many families we have. Let's say 100 families. Take the conversation. 100 families are no longer that core group that we had at the beginning, who sort of were raised in classical education, who had read the old reconstructions from the 70s and 80s. The majority of people that are coming in are people coming from different and very unique backgrounds. Former Lutherans, former Catholics, lots of former Baptists, from all walks of life. And that means now they're coming in, and they realize that we're realizing as a church that these are people that are very different from one another. So now our pastoral tasks, as our church has grown, our pastoral tasks have increased dramatically. And I know the old humorous adage about more people, more problems. It hasn't been that way for us. We've had our problems, of course. That's the nature of it. But it's been more people and more opportunities to direct people to godly living, godly marriages, which means my counseling office is always very full. My associate always has a full agenda as well. And so God has really prospered us in that sense. So He's brought a lot of different people. And when these people, what they experience coming to our congregation is a kind of a titanic sort of a shock wave of objectivity, because they come from traditions where everybody kind of does their own thing, and we see you on Sunday. But now you have a community that is not forcing you, but compelling you gracefully to be a part of something larger than what happens in the Lord's Day. So in other words, the Lord's Day becomes this center focus, and then the overflow of that is the hospitality of the church from Monday through Saturday. And that's what I want to see happening, and I pray that's taking place now at Providence, even with a larger number. But it's been 17 wonderful years, and even though early on I thought to myself, maybe the grass is greener on the other side, what I've discovered, nevertheless, as I have been to various other grasses And I've realized that I treasure our problems better than theirs. And so the problems that God has for us here in Pensacola are problems that are distinct to our people. And I also realize that God has equipped me to deal with these particular problems. And so I'm extremely grateful for the blessings, the generosity, and also the graciousness and patience of a congregation who has seen me take more and more leadership roles, who has seen me absent from the pulpit many Sundays this past year especially, but who have believed in the vision. And as a result of that, when I'm home, it's even sweeter, you know?
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned your associate, Al Stout,
Yeah,
who I think bears a lot of the burden when you're away.
he does.
I love Al, of course, and we love the
Everybody
Stouts.
loves Al.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your relationship with him and how that works so well and how you guys work so well together?
Yeah, there are few people on planet Earth that I speak with more than Al Stout. My wife, I speak more substantially with her. Though with Al, I can say honestly that we have probably talked, going back to the AOL days. Going back to AOL days, I think we talk virtually every day at some level or another. Now we have the privilege of sharing an office together, so we see each other in the same building, which we didn't have until a year ago. So for many, many years, for 16, 17 years, we just chatted through online groups or on the phone or things like that, or saw each other at different events. But now we see each other even more frequently, which has been a delight. Al brings the military experience, so there's that kind of life that brings its own level of fervor and zeal, and he's been able to sort of apply that to the life of the church. He has incredible gifts. As you know, he's a very determined man, and we've been part of many political events over the years. He's got a great heart for the pro-life work that we've done here in Pensacola, but also fighting against some of the travesties that we're seeing here now of the drag queen show in Pensacola downtown on the 23rd of December, which he has been very much in the forefront in making sure that that travesty doesn't take place. But he also has very unique pastoral skills. He's very good with talking to men. He certainly communicates much better than I do with the military population in our church, which is increasing. He has a very sober way of looking at the world. He's also very seasoned. He just turned 60 years old. And I have great admiration for Al Stout. He's been a good friend for many, many years. We've gone through so many great stories together. And I think in the end, we both look at each other and say, I think both of us can say with a high degree of certainty, thanks be to God. God has been gracious to us in every way.
Yeah, amen. He's a blessing to the community at large, for sure. Yeah, Al's a real treasure. And so is Providence. I don't go to Providence.
Yes.
But people ask me.
You're an honorary member. Yeah. That's what you are. Yeah.
I'm very honored to be an honorary member. I always tell people I'm good friends with Providence.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, that's the same thing about the cross. In fact, I've encouraged members of Providence to go to the cross.
Yeah.
So I think there's a mutuality there.
Yeah. There are times when, it's a better fit for one or the other.
Yep.
Yeah. So Uri, what are sort of your hopes and aspirations? You mentioned the building. That's exciting. You guys will be in a building pretty soon.
Lord willing.
I think January, you said.
January the 11th, our inaugural service.
That's exciting. What are some of your hopes and aspirations for Providence in these next few years?
That's a terrific question. I have a lot of aspirations, which is probably part of my problem. I have very much a visionary kind of guy. But the one thing, I want to just focus on one thing that really, two things in particular draw my attention is, number one, the facility. I think having our own space to be able to, if I were to die tomorrow, I could say, this is 9600 North Palafox Street is our identity. This is our address. This is where God has placed us. This is our geographical sacred space. That, I think, is going to provide a kind of a longevity that it's hard to have when you're using a school, however wonderful it may be. You always feel like you're a wanderer, that kind of thing, even though our relationship with the school has been beyond great. But that will provide a little bit of stability for the long term. So as we plan for 20, 30 years, what does that look like? Well, it looks like a specific address. Where does it look like? It looks like it's here. That's the one thing. The second thing is the possibility that we've been contemplating of starting a classical college in Pensacola, Florida. And we have a tentative date for that, which is August of 2027. We've been thinking about this technically for over 15 years, but now we believe we have the mass, the interest, and the facility to accomplish all these things. Those are the kind of three elements we wanted to make sure we had in place. And so if the interest is there, if the numbers are there, and if we have a location, I believe that we're in the right season to offer something like that. Something that would carry a bit of the ethos of what you see at New St. Andrews College, but with a Pensacola, Providence flavor, right? We're culturally very different for sure. We share ecclesiastical interests, but if you've been in the Pacific Northwest and the South, it feels like different galaxies, just to be really honest. And so because of that, we want to offer a kind of a unique flavor to what that classical college would look like. That to me is the kind of thing that just invigorates me, that possibility. So I'm very eager, Lord willing, to share more details in the next few months, especially in the year 2026, about what this would look like, and to really gauge whether the interest is as real as I envision it. What I found fascinating is when I travel, I've had people ask me without knowledge, what about a college in Pensacola? So at the very least, what I see now is at least that Pensacola has become a bit of a kind of a headquarters to think in the way we think about what education should look like. And we also happen to have a wonderful classical school. So there's a lot of things in place that could make this a reality. And those are the things I'm most looking forward to. I'll add a third thing. And that is that we need to nourish future pastors. We need to cultivate future pastors. Right now we have people, we mentioned the Charlie Kirk incident, we have millions of people interested in coming to church, but we have certainly a need for equipped ministers. And what I hope happens in the next few years, especially here in town, is that through our internship program, we're able to provide more ministers to shepherd and to plant churches, because I don't think there's never a time in which you say we have enough churches. I think we should have a church in every neighborhood. We need these sacred spaces to guide communities. And I think Pensacola is very ripe for these kinds of things.
Yeah, that's great. I am definitely interested. Well, I love all of that.
Yeah.
I'm definitely interested to learn more about the college opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been desiring to have one of those here too.
Yes.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Uri, what about a story about you that more people need to hear? I know you've done a million podcasts and many sermons. There's probably not a ton about you that people can't find somewhere, but
that is true. Becoming more and more so.
Is there anything specific that you think more people should hear about you?
I think some people are shocked to know that I've had other interests before I was a pastor. People think that I've just lived most of my life, at least my adult life, in the academic church world, and that there are other things that I do besides reading and writing and meeting people pastorally. Among them is actually one of the things that I published early on that became relatively successful, not here, but in Brazil, which was a book on pipe smoking that I wrote. And it's called Holy Incense. And I thought that was a very brilliant title. And I co-wrote it with another Brazilian friend of mine, Joffrey the Giant, Joffrey Swait, who has actually taught actors how to smoke pipes. And so he's very, very much gifted in that area. And I contributed with an essay to it, and it became kind of a little booklet that was published and translated into Portuguese and is sold here quite a bit. In fact, there have been people who visit our church because of that book. Not because of anything theologically I've done, and so I have a great love for pipe smoking, and I love tobaccos. But when I was younger in Brazil, there were two professions that I wanted to pursue. And one of them was I wanted to pursue a beach volleyball career. I actually played beach volleyball more than I did soccer. I knew I didn't have a future in soccer. I don't think I was a goalie and a defensive player. I didn't think I had the skills necessary to pursue a career in professional soccer. But I thought that I had a good chance in pursuing professional volleyball at the beach level, which is very demanding physically. The beach world is just very demanding. You don't have the flexibility. You can't run as easily. And so it's a very physically demanding sport, but I had a great love for it. I wanted to pursue that route. And then the other thing I wanted to pursue was I wanted to pursue a degree in classical guitar. I had a great affection for this guitarist called Paco de Lucia, who played some amazing guitar. And the earliest memories I have of music if you set aside Guns N' Roses and Pink Floyd, which was part of my background for most of my childhood, was opera and classical guitar. And so I've had a lot of love for that. There have been times where I've always thought people have asked me, why don't you pursue music, a career in maybe opera singing? I thought about all these things, but for some reason or another, the death of my father, the transitions that have occurred in my life, my call to the ministry, these have become more hobbies than anything else. And so I still love these worlds very, very much. But I did find great interest in these things before God called me to ministry.
Yeah.
What I find, as a side note, what I find interesting is if you read great biographies of pastors and preachers over the years, over the centuries, you'll find that pastors are called very early on in life. Like there's some great preachers that will talk in their memoirs or journals about being called to the ministry when they were like 4 or 5. So pastoral callings have happened historically very young. Mine didn't happen that way. Mine was quite different. I was called much later. And so as a result, I had some habits that I loved early on, which I'm glad it happened that way. But there were other things in my mind as well back then.
Yeah, that's all very cool. Well, and music is a huge part of who you are now.
Well, there's that, right?
Yeah.
There's that.
So it's still there.
Yeah.
We could probably do another whole episode on that.
We sure could, yeah.
Might have to have you back for that one.
Well, I'd be delighted to.
Yeah. What is something about you that you want your great-grandchildren to know?
I think when I am forgotten, which will not be too long after my death, most people are forgotten very soon. Ecclesiastes talks about that, the nature of our identities and how life is vaporous, vapor of vapor, says the preacher. And when I am forgotten, if my great-grandchildren remember my name in some level or another, in some manner or another, I would like them to know that their great-grandfather was flawed, but that he repented well. And that's the kind of message I want to convey, that within my frailties and my weakness as a man, and even someone who is called to do a great work of proclaiming the kingdom, administering the sacrament Sunday after Sunday, that I was flawed, and this is not a way of debasing myself or woe is me, but to say that I was very keenly aware of my sinfulness, but that I am even far more aware of the forgiveness I have in Christ. And the thing that mediates these two actions is repentance. And so I want them to know at least that I was flawed, but I repented well. And when I repented, it wasn't done in a form of flippancy to do away with the subject, but I repented like a Hebraic man, like a Puritan man. Woe is me, for I am undone. Forgive me, for I have sinned. Will you walk with me now in light of this here? And so that's a message that always comes to mind when I think of what legacy I want to leave my children and my grandchildren or great-grandchildren one day.
Amen. Yeah. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you hoped I would ask?
You never asked me about what my favorite soccer team is in Brazil,
Oh.
which is virtually the most insignificant of all questions. I have developed this habit with my children. They love Brazilian soccer. We have this software that allows us to watch Brazilian soccer in Portuguese.
Oh, nice.
So I don't know if my children ever watch a soccer game in English in their lives. They have to watch it in Portuguese. But I have a tremendous affection for São Paulo Futebol Clube, which my mother remembers that she remembers watching me cry at one of their victories when I was 3 years old.
Oh, wow.
And I have a great love for São Paulo. It is the two things that I still follow very much in Brazil is I still follow Brazilian politics and my soccer team. In fact, I read at least 15 minutes of Portuguese commentary every single day in related to soccer, related to my team. And so I know I'm in the South, so whatever college football team you cheer for, it's that level of fondness, but because it's Brazilian soccer, probably 100 times more fervors. And soccer is it's a big part of, you're identified in Brazil. But let me tell you this, even in São Paulo, which is where my team comes from, São Paulo is a state and then it's a city as well. So my team comes from the city of São Paulo. And if São Paulo were to be divided into 4 different regions, right, north, south, east, and west, the 4 major teams in São Paulo are located in these 4 regions. So if you cheer for São Paulo, you live in this part of São Paulo. If you cheer for Palmeiras, it's very common for you to live in this part of the city. And so just think about that dynamic. It doesn't make any sense here in this country, but Brazil is very much in that, it's formed in that way. The ethos of Brazil, the GDP of Brazil grows if Brazil wins a World Cup. It's very likely that the president will be reelected if he wins the World Cup. So everything is fed through the world of athletics, specifically football, soccer. And so I have it's my way of keeping in touch with my home country, even though my dear wife always says that I was born in the wrong century and in the wrong country. And she's probably true, but the way I keep up with my home country is by following my favorite soccer team.
That's neat.
There you go.
That's a fascinating dynamic.
It really is. Yeah, it really is.
It's very cool. So Uri, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah.
I know you have some time constraints, and thanks again for giving me so much of your time. It's probably hard for people to not find you online, but for anybody out there, where can folks find you?
If anybody has a modicum of interest in anything I've ever produced as a theologian, as a pastor, I have consolidated all their concerns to one place.
Okay.
I made life easier for everybody. And it's just UriBrito.com.
Beautiful.
UriBrito.com is where you'll find my videos. You'll find resources that I've done over the last 15, 20 years. You'll also find my Substack, which is published every Tuesday and Friday. And in fact, early this morning, I just published an essay on Bonhoeffer's Life Together. Bonhoeffer's been a source of great delight, and in our days, great hatred. And it's been my joy to sort of rescue Bonhoeffer from all the haters out there. And his book, Life Together, is a wonderful. That was my latest Substack this morning. And so UriBrito.com is the main place to find me.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks again, man. Any day that I get to spend some time with you is a good day. And it truly is an honor and a joy to call you friend.
Matthew, my pleasure, brother. Thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it.
And cut.
All right. Cut.